Please subscribe and share for more story. The sentence wasn't shouted. It wasn't sharpened with anger or wrapped in cruelty. It was delivered the way people deliver office instructions, flat, efficient, final. You'll eat after everyone else. That was what her daughter said. And in that quiet moment, something inside Margaret Hale didn't crack loudly or explode. It simply detached, like a slab of ice slipping away from a glacier that had been straining for years. There was no rage, no heat rushing to her face. Only an empty hollow where obedience had lived for decades. Margaret stood in the kitchen, holding the edge of the counter, her eyes drifting toward the herb-crusted pork roast resting in the pan. She had started preparing it before sunrise, hours of brining, slow roasting, careful basting. Food made with patience, with pride. From the dining room came laughter, her daughter Diana, her son-in-law Paul, their children, and a handful of guests. Their voices were bright, careless. Margaret lifted the roasting pan. The heat bit through the foil, sharp and grounding. Without a word, she turned toward the front door. No one noticed her leave. No gasp. No chair scraping back. No hurried footsteps following her into the hallway. The laughter simply dipped for a second, then resumed, forks clinking against porcelain as if nothing important had happened at all. Outside, the autumn air struck her skin with surprising cold, clearing her head. It smelled like damp leaves and distant wood smoke. Margaret adjusted her grip on the pan, steady despite its weight. She walked slowly, carefully, down the porch steps and onto the sidewalk. 3 blocks separated Diana's house from hers. 3 blocks she walked without stopping, the pan held in front of her like a shield. Her arms ached, but she did not falter. This was her food, her work, her dignity. The quiet of the street wrapped around her, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath her shoes. When she reached her own front door, she paused, breathing deeply, then unlocked it. The house greeted her with familiar smells, lemon polish, old books, dust warmed by afternoon light. It had not felt like home since Diana convinced her to move in temporarily the year before. Margaret set the pan down gently on her own kitchen counter. "It'll be easier for you, Mom," Diana had said back then, smiling with practiced confidence. "No bills to worry about. No yard work. We'll take care of you." Margaret understood now what went unsaid. On our terms. She stood in her quiet kitchen, listening to the soft tick of the grandfather clock she hadn't wound in months. There were no televisions blaring, no voices calling her name, no one asking for nutmeg or complaining about lumpy potatoes. Just silence, thick, comforting, complete. She opened a cabinet and took down one of her old plates, white with pale blue flowers around the rim and a small chip she'd always loved. She sliced the roast carefully, spooned the rich drippings over it, and sat at the small breakfast table by the window. Margaret ate slowly, deliberately. The meat was tender, perfectly seasoned. It might have been the best thing she had ever cooked. No one praised it. No one interrupted. And for the first time in years, she tasted every bite. When she finished, she washed the plate, dried it with a linen towel, and put it away. Then she moved to the armchair by the bay window and watched the silver maple outside sway in the rising wind. She used to rake those leaves herself every fall. "That's too dangerous now, Mom," Diana had insisted. "You could fall, break a hip." Diana never asked if Margaret enjoyed the work. Never asked how the crisp air felt in her lungs or how satisfying the scrape of the rake against pavement was. She only told her what she could no longer do. Diana had always been a teller. Margaret leaned back and closed her eyes, hearing her daughter's voice again, sharp, precise. "You'll eat after everyone else." As if she were hired help. As if decades of motherhood had been erased. Feeding her children. Nursing fevers. Raising grandchildren. Reduced to a line on a mental chore chart. Margaret had known this moment was coming. It had been building for years, in small surrenders she told herself didn't matter. That one sentence simply illuminated everything. She sat there as the house darkened, remembering all the times she had swallowed her words. When Diana snapped at her in front of Paul because she loaded the dishwasher wrong. When Diana rolled her eyes at her confusion with his smart television. When Diana looked at her dress before a party and said, "Oh, Mom, that's a bit old-fashioned." When Diana suggested she start planning for the end, like milk nearing its expiration date. Margaret thought of her other daughter, Helen, gone nearly a decade now to an illness that had moved too fast and spared nothing. Helen had been gentle, the kind who brought tea without being asked, who called every Wednesday just to hear her mother's voice. Helen left behind a daughter, Lucy. Lucy would be grown now, old enough to see through pretenses. Margaret wondered what Lucy would have thought if she'd seen her walk out carrying the roast. And then Margaret thought of herself, the girl she had once been, the woman she had become. She wasn't bitter. She was tired. Tired of living in someone else's shadow. Tired of being spoken to like an obligation. Tired of confusing being needed with being loved. Margaret stood, joints protesting, and went to the pantry. She pulled out a pen and a small notepad. There were things she needed to do. Her name was still on the deed to this house. Her savings were still in accounts under her own name. She still had power. She had simply forgotten where she placed it. Outside, street lights flickered on. Somewhere across town, Diana was likely realizing the main dish was gone. Maybe someone was asking where Margaret was. Maybe not. It didn't matter. That night, Margaret slept in her own bed under her own roof. The phone rang twice. Diana's name lit up the screen. Margaret watched it glow, then fade. No message followed. There never was one. Diana preferred the demand of ringing. It had worked for years. It didn't anymore. Margaret slept deeply. Not the sleep of peace, but of exhaustion finally lifted. She woke at dawn, as she always had, but there was no one to cook for. No lunchboxes to pack. She sat at her kitchen table with tea and a slice of cold roast. She didn't bother reheating it. By 8 o'clock, she had made a list. Check accounts. Call a lawyer. Review documents. She pulled out the old accordion folder labeled house. Inside were receipts for renovations she had paid for. Utility bills now in Diana's name. Notes written in Diana's neat handwriting, suggestions to streamline things. Margaret finally understood what that word meant. She remembered the day Diana convinced her to add her name to one checking account. Just for emergencies, Mom. Margaret had thought she was being careful. That's how control happens, she realized. Not all at once. Piece by piece. She opened her old laptop and clicked forgot password. The security questions were still hers, about her first dog, the street she grew up on. When her balance appeared on the screen, untouched, a wave of relief washed over her so strongly she had to steady herself. She would go to the bank in person. She wanted paper records. Clear boundaries. This wasn't revenge. It was clarity. Her eyes drifted to a photo stuck to the refrigerator. Margaret and Helen stood in the garden, Lucy between them, laughing. Not posing. Just joy. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed Lucy's number from memory. Grandma? Lucy answered. Hi, sweetheart. There was a pause. Are you okay? Yes, Margaret said softly. I am now. Lucy laughed quietly. Good. I left, Margaret added. Last night. Another pause. Then, good for you. They made plans for lunch the next day. After the call, Margaret opened windows, dusted shelves, polished wood. The house seemed to breathe with her. She stood in the backyard, touching the dry soil of the garden beds. Parsley still clung to life. A few stubborn marigolds bowed their heads. Diana had told her to let the garden go. Margaret shook her head. You don't let go of what reminds you who you are. That afternoon, she opened an old box of letters from Helen. Real letters. Ink on paper. One sentence stayed with her. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of being forgotten. Margaret held the letter to her chest. You aren't forgotten, she whispered. Later, she wrote Lucy a letter of her own. Not a complaint. Just a memory. She sealed it carefully. Lucy arrived mid-morning with pastries and a smile that felt like sunlight. They drank tea at the kitchen table, unhurried. I saw Mom last night, Lucy said quietly. She looked shocked. Margaret nodded. So was I. I'm glad you left, Lucy said. So am I. Lucy handed her a set of keys. For emergencies, she said. And just because. Margaret smiled. That means I have to keep good cookies again. Absolutely. They talked until the pastries were gone. When Lucy left, Margaret didn't feel lonely. She felt whole. After Lucy left, Margaret stood alone in the doorway for a long moment, watching the street settle back into stillness. She expected the quiet to feel heavy. Instead, it felt earned. She closed the door, turned the lock, and rested her palm against the wood as if grounding herself in the simple fact of choice. No one would tell her where to sit today. No one would decide when she ate or slept or spoke. She moved through the house slowly, touching familiar things: the worn arm of the sofa, the edge of the bookshelf, the crooked lamp she had refused to replace. Each object carried a memory, not of usefulness, but of ownership. In the afternoon, she gathered a small pile of laundry and folded it by hand, not rushing. When her knee complained, she sat. When it eased, she stood again. That rhythm belonged to her now. She brewed tea and drank it by the window, watching shadows shift across the floor. The phone remained silent. Margaret noticed she no longer flinched at that. Silence, she realized, was only frightening when it was imposed. When it was chosen, it felt like space. As evening approached, Margaret opened the old cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She hadn't looked inside it in years. The lid creaked softly, releasing the faint scent of lavender and thyme. Inside were fragments of a life she had paused rather than ended: old scarves, ticket stubs, photographs, and a small stack of notebooks bound with elastic. She sat on the edge of the bed and flipped one open. Poems. Not great ones, perhaps, but honest. Lines she had written in her 40s, in stolen moments after dinner, when the house was finally quiet. She smiled at one and read it aloud, her voice thin at first, then steadier. No one interrupted. No one corrected her tone. Margaret closed the notebook and set it beside her. I forgot you, she said softly, not with guilt, but recognition. Later, she made herself soup and ate it standing at the counter, listening to the radio. A song she hadn't heard in years came on, and without thinking, she swayed slightly, just enough to feel it. Her body remembered what her life had not allowed. That night, Diana called again. Once. Margaret let it ring. She imagined the sound traveling across town, bouncing off walls filled with people who had eaten well and spoken loudly and never noticed who was missing. Margaret turned off the lamp and went to bed. She slept lightly, but without regret. In the morning, she woke with a stiffness she accepted and a clarity she did not question. She dressed carefully, choosing a blouse she liked rather than one that blended in. At the bank, she spoke calmly and clearly. I'd like to remove joint access, she said. The teller nodded, professional and uncurious. Forms were printed, signatures added. Control restored, quietly. On the walk home, Margaret stopped at the small bookstore she hadn't entered in years. She bought a thin book of poetry and a notebook with a blue cover. At home, she placed them on the kitchen table where she would see them daily. Not as a promise to produce anything impressive, but as permission to begin. That afternoon, she called a lawyer and scheduled a consultation. When she hung up, her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from movement after stillness. As dusk settled, Margaret stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. Nothing elaborate. Just enough. The radio murmured softly, the knife tapped rhythmically against the board, and for once, no one commented on how she did it. She ate at her small table, then washed the dishes and dried them with care. Before bed, she wrote a single sentence in the new notebook. Today, I chose myself. She read it twice, nodded, and closed the book. Outside, the maple leaves rattled in the wind, and she felt no need to stop them, rake them, or explain them to anyone. Somewhere else, Diana might still be waiting for a response, a signal that authority had been restored. It wouldn't come. Margaret turned off the lights and climbed into bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. She was awake. And tomorrow, she would wake again. Not as someone's background presence, not as a favor being tolerated, but as Margaret Hale, moving forward at her own pace, in her own quiet, undeniable way. Morning arrived with a thin veil of fog clinging to the street, the kind that softened edges and made everything feel newly possible. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the world come into focus. She didn't rush herself. There was nowhere she needed to be for anyone else. After breakfast, she opened the hall closet and pulled out her old coat, the one Diana had insisted was too heavy and unnecessary. It fit perfectly. Outside, the air was sharp and honest. Margaret walked slowly down the block, nodding to a neighbor she vaguely recognized. "Morning," the woman said. "Morning," Margaret replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. She walked farther than she planned, pausing when her knee protested, then continuing when it settled. When she returned home, cheeks flushed, she felt accomplished in a way that had nothing to do with productivity. She made a simple lunch and ate it without distraction. No television. No phone. Just the scrape of fork against plate. That afternoon, she sat at the table and reviewed her list again, crossing off what she had already done. The list was shorter now. So was the weight she carried. Later that day, Margaret found herself standing in front of the sewing box again. She carried it to the dining table and opened it fully this time, sorting through buttons and spools as if reacquainting herself with old friends. She threaded a needle slowly, tongue pressed lightly against her lip in concentration. Her fingers were stiffer than they used to be, but they remembered. She began with a simple repair, a loose hem on a napkin, nothing that required perfection. As she worked, she spoke aloud without realizing it. "Still got it," she murmured, then laughed softly at herself. The sound startled her. She hadn't heard it in a while. In the evening, the phone rang again. Margaret glanced at the screen. Diana. She let it ring, then surprised herself by answering on the last chime. "Mom," Diana said, brisk as ever. "Where have you been?" Margaret considered the question. "Home," she replied. There was a pause. "We should talk," Diana said. "Yes," Margaret agreed calmly. "We should. Another time." She ended the call before permission could be negotiated. Her hands shook afterward, but only briefly. That night, Margaret dreamed of dancing. Not well, not gracefully, but freely. She woke with the image lingering, a warmth in her chest that stayed even after her feet touched the cold floor. Over breakfast, she opened the blue notebook and wrote again. Just a paragraph this time. Not poetry. A memory. The smell of her mother's kitchen. The sound of rain on tin. She didn't judge the words. She let them exist. In the afternoon, she visited the library where she once worked, the building unchanged except for brighter lights and quieter corners. "Margaret?" a former colleague asked, surprised. "It's been years." "It has," Margaret agreed, smiling. They talked briefly, kindly. No explanations required. On her way out, Margaret lingered by the bulletin board, reading flyers for book clubs and community classes. She tore off one small tab. At home, she placed it on the refrigerator with a magnet. It wasn't a commitment, just a possibility. That evening, Lucy texted a photo of a pie cooling on a windowsill. Practicing, the message read. Margaret smiled. "Good," she said aloud. "You always were paying attention." As the week unfolded, Margaret noticed subtle changes. She stood straighter. She paused before answering questions, even her own. When Diana called again, Margaret didn't avoid the conversation, but she didn't surrender to it either. "I'm staying here," she said plainly. "This is my home." Diana protested, reasoned, softened her voice. Margaret listened, then repeated herself. The conversation ended without resolution and without guilt. On Friday afternoon, Lucy came by with groceries and stories, filling the house with easy conversation. They cooked together, bumping elbows, laughing when the sauce splashed. "You seem lighter," Lucy said. Margaret nodded. "I put something down," she replied. That night, After Lucy left, Margaret sat alone at the table, a single candle burning. She looked around, not with nostalgia, but with intention. This was not an ending. It was a return. She blew out the candle and stood, joints aching, heart steady. Tomorrow there would be more choices. Some difficult, some small, but all of them hers. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, a scent Margaret found oddly reassuring. She sat upright in the chair, hands folded in her lap, listening as the woman across the desk explained options without urgency or judgment. "You're not late," the lawyer said gently, as if reading her thoughts. "You're right on time." Margaret exhaled. They spoke about deeds, powers of attorney, and boundaries written in ink rather than emotion. Margaret asked questions and waited for answers instead of nodding automatically. When she left, a thin folder tucked under her arm, she felt taller. At home, she brewed tea and opened the folder again, reading through it slowly. That evening, Diana showed up unannounced. The knock was sharp, familiar. Margaret opened the door without stepping aside. "You can't just disappear," Diana said. "I didn't," Margaret replied. "I came home." Diana sighed, rubbing her temple. "You embarrass me." Margaret met her gaze. "You dismissed me." The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Diana looked away first. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one Margaret had eaten at alone just days earlier. Diana spoke quickly, listing concerns disguised as care. "We were only trying to help. You can't manage everything yourself." Margaret listened without interrupting. When Diana finished, Margaret folded her hands. "Help isn't help if it costs me my voice," she said quietly. Diana scoffed. "You're being dramatic." Margaret shook her head. "I'm being honest." Silence followed, unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Finally, Diana asked, "What do you want?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Respect," she said. "And space." Diana laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "You'll change your mind." Margaret stood. "No," she said. "I won't." She walked to the door and opened it. Diana hesitated, then stood. At the threshold, she turned back. "You're making a mistake." Margaret held the door open. "I've made enough already." Diana left without another word. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, heart pounding, but steady. The days that followed were quieter. Diana did not call. Margaret didn't reach out. She focused on routines that felt like promises kept. Morning walks, writing a few lines each afternoon, watering the stubborn parsley. Lucy visited when she could, sometimes staying for dinner, sometimes just stopping by to talk. One evening, Lucy brought up the roast incident. "Mom says you overreacted," she said carefully. Margaret smiled without humor. "People say that when they're used to your silence," she replied. Lucy nodded slowly. "I see that now." They cooked. Together, hands moving in comfortable rhythm. Later, Margaret sat alone with her notebook, writing about strength, not the loud kind, but the kind that holds its ground. She thought of Helen again, of her quiet courage. "You would have liked this version of me," Margaret whispered. The house answered with a soft creak, the settling of wood, the sound of belonging. On Sunday morning, Margaret attended a small poetry reading at the community center. She sat in the back, listening, not comparing herself to the voices on stage. When the organizer asked if anyone wanted to share something informal, Margaret surprised herself by standing. Her hands trembled as she read a short piece she had written the night before. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Applause followed, not loud, but sincere. On the walk home, she felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. At home, she pinned the community flyer to the refrigerator next to Lucy's photo. She brewed tea and sat by the window, watching the maple leaves fall freely, without instruction. Margaret smiled. She hadn't reclaimed everything. Some losses couldn't be undone, but she had reclaimed enough. Her voice, her pace, her place. And that, she knew, was the beginning of a life no longer negotiated, but lived. As October deepened, Margaret noticed how time behaved differently when it belonged to her. Days no longer blurred into obligations. They stacked gently, one atop another, each with its own shape. She spent a morning sorting old photographs, not to preserve them for anyone else, but simply to remember. She laughed aloud at one where her hair was far too big, and her smile, even bigger. "Who are you showing off for?" she asked the image. No answer came, and she liked that. In the afternoon, she met Lucy for coffee downtown. They talked about books, about nothing important, about everything that mattered. "You don't apologize as much anymore," Lucy observed. Margaret paused, then nodded. "I noticed that too." That evening, she received a short message from Diana. "Hope you're well." Nothing more. Margaret read it twice, then set the phone down. She didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because she no longer felt required to translate herself into comfort for someone else. Some silences were answers. The first frost arrived quietly, silvering the grass overnight. Margaret wrapped herself in her coat and stood in the garden, assessing what remained. She clipped herbs carefully, her breath puffing in small clouds. Inside, she hung them upside down to dry, the kitchen filling with familiar scents. That afternoon, she attended her first book club meeting at the library. She sat among strangers and felt no need to perform. When it was her turn to speak, she did, clearly, briefly. A woman across from her smiled and said, "You have a thoughtful way of seeing things." Margaret felt the compliment settle somewhere deep. Later, she cooked a simple meal and set the table for one without flinching. Alone did not mean abandoned. Alone meant undiluted. Before bed, she wrote another sentence in her notebook. "I no longer confuse endurance with love." She slept well that night, dreams untroubled. Weeks passed. Diana eventually called again, her voice softer, cautious. "Lucy says you're doing well," she said. "I am," Margaret replied. There was a pause. "We miss you," Diana added. Margaret considered the words. "I believe you," she said. "But missing someone isn't the same as respecting them." Diana didn't argue. That felt like progress, even if it was small. After the call, Margaret didn't feel shaken. She felt settled. She spent the afternoon sewing, finally cutting into the blue fabric she'd saved for years. The stitches weren't perfect, but they were honest. When Lucy came by that evening, Margaret showed her the half-finished dress. "It's beautiful," Lucy said. "It will be," Margaret corrected gently. They laughed. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and Margaret felt no urge to quiet it. On a crisp Sunday morning, Margaret visited Helen's grave. She brought no flowers, just her notebook. She sat on the bench and read aloud a few lines she had written, her voice steady. "I'm not forgotten," she said quietly. "And neither are you." She stayed a while, listening to the wind move through bare branches. On the walk back to her car, she passed a young woman struggling with a stroller. Margaret stopped without thinking and helped. "Thank you," the woman said, relieved. Margaret smiled. "Of course." The exchange was small, ordinary, and deeply affirming. Back home, she made soup and shared it with Lucy, who had stopped by unexpectedly. "You seem solid," Lucy said. Margaret nodded. "I feel rooted," she replied. That night, she placed the finished dress neatly in a drawer. It would be worn when it was ready. Winter edged closer, but Margaret did not shrink from it. She layered sweaters, brewed stronger tea, and kept her routines intact. The house hummed softly with life, not loud, not crowded, but present. One evening, she stood at the window watching snow begin to fall, each flake choosing its own path. Margaret smiled at the simplicity of it. She had not reclaimed her life in a single dramatic moment, but in hundreds of quiet decisions. Choosing to leave, choosing to stay, choosing to speak, choosing to be still. She turned off the light, climbed into bed, and pulled the quilt up to her chin. Tomorrow would come, as it always did. And when it did, she would meet it not as an afterthought, not as a favor being tolerated, but as a woman fully returned to herself. Thanks for watching. If you value stories of respect, dignity, and justice, please subscribe. It means more than you know, and it lets me keep sharing the lessons life has carved into me.